Welcome to the Ohio Lodge of Research Connections. In this episode, our Worshipful Master, Brother Chad Kopenski, concludes his conversation with Alex G. Powers, the host of the Historical Light Podcast. And in this conversation, they cover many different topics, including research beyond history, and many of the fond memories that Alex has from his podcast and the conversations he's had with brothers of Masonry.
The big danger right now with Masonic research is certainty. Like once you think like you know this fact and you run a pretty solid foundation, like you still got to keep looking, right? You never is that you should never really be satisfied in terms of your certainty, right?
Yeah, it's harder, it's irresponsible to be satisfied, I think, in a big opinion, right? Because we weren't there. When you're looking at historical stuff, now, I mean, there are certain stuff we're there for, but when you're looking at historical stuff, even when we're reading, a biography, this is irresponsible of me to loop this in, but, it could prove the point, I suppose. We keep talking about the forget-me-not. I don't think there was any intentional harm intended behind that story.
No.
It's a feel-good story, and it has probably brought a lot of good to Masonry over the years, as that has been presented.
Small T truth versus capital T truth, right?
100%.
Absolutely.
Right. So no intentional harm done there, but there was a source story behind it that's different. So it's important to. And I guess where I was going with that, Masons are proud individuals. We like to make Masonry the best thing since sliced bread. We just do. Masonry itself is very, very good. Masons are humans. Even the best of us are not the best at all times. Have I been the best Mason I could be since I became a Mason? No. Some days, yes. Some days I impress myself. Other days, I purely disappoint myself. And, I love him or hate him. Albert Pike, and I cannot tell you what book it was. It may have been Esoterica. But there was one point where he's talking about the degrees. And he's going in and basically saying how, for one, we get rushed through the degrees. But kind of how dare we call ourselves Master Masons? Like, have we mastered this in any shape or form? Even the most knowledgeable, the most accomplished of us, have we mastered what Freemasonry really is? It's like, no. And then even if you have, at that point in time, it's a moving target, right? Just because you mastered, I'm jumping all over the place here. Doc from my lodge is a master ritualist. He passed that test in the 70s. The ritual is not the same as it was back then.
Exactly right.
Right? So he was a master in the 70s, but to this day, he'll tell you exactly how it was back then, and it may slip a little bit from what it is today. It's a moving target. So mastering is a continuous art. We're continuously trying to get better.
Yeah, we've talked about, in Masonry, we're really good about resting on our laurels, but what's more important is what are you working on now? Plus, you and I have both done, I did martial arts, you've done, many other things where it's, as soon as you think you've mastered something, your body changes, or like it's always a practice, not a perfection. So,
yeah. Well, one other side to that, and kind of tying into what, Pike was talking about, how dare we call ourselves this? We get really caught up on the firm image in our head of the rough and the smooth ashlar, and going through and trying to chisel off those rough points. Well, on a stone, when you've perfected a stone, unless you mess with it more, it's always perfect. Like that stone is, if you make it perfect today, unless something happens to it, it's going to be pretty dang perfect. It's going to stay smooth. But we are living stones, and I think it references that, right? So living things tend to grow. And even though I have chiseled this one spot smooth as it can be today, I may grow a rough spot next year, 5 years from now. that then I need to go back and readdress. Like, we're given the tools for a reason, because we're going to need to use them more than once.
There's a certain sense of futility that comes out of that, right? Like, come on, I'm perfect enough, aren't I? Can't I just be perfect and just be done? But yeah. What I've also found kind of like you said, and like I think most of us feel like, the work never ends. Like it's always something. It's as soon as you think you've reached this goal, it's that they move the goalpost 5 yards down that way. But as long as you keep traveling and moving, then that's all that matters.
And I think that's what
ahead,
we're encouraged towards in Freemasonry. We're kind of, while we're from vast different walks of life, we're kind of all of that same cut, that we are encouraged and seeking to continuously be better. We're also given that option in life. Like, you can just be a crap person and decide, I'm good with this, and just be a crap person. That's your choice. We try to, not take that path in Masonry. Masons, we want to look for people that are seeking that improvement, that constant improvement. We don't always meet the mark, and we've let guys into Masonry that aren't that way, but that's kind of the goal. That's the flock that we're trying to get around us, is guys that are all different levels that all want to get better. And we can help ourselves communally together in that process.
And different viewpoints. We kind of mentioned this earlier. I mean, I'm always nervous first off, I'm nervous when people think of themselves, I am the smartest person in this room.
That's dangerous.
If you're constantly saying to yourself, I'm the smartest person in this room, you need to be in a different room.
Yeah.
Then you need to get to the point where you stop keeping score. Like, you know what I mean? Like, when you stop going, where am I on the list of smart people in this room? Because that's not what it's all about.
Right.
We talked about the self, like that's kind of the danger with Masonic research. I wonder how many guys get an idea, get a question in their mind and think to themselves, if this were important, somebody else would have researched it by now.
Yeah.
Or like, this is nothing. I'm researching, a junior warden from my lodge from 20 years ago. Nobody cares about this stuff. So,
yeah, no, I get what you're saying. And
that's one obstacle I see, that kind of like denigration of your own idea, or that, devaluing of your own voice or your own thoughts. And I don't know, that's a pretty big obstacle to get over, but how do we get guys to say, no, that's actually pretty cool, go with that? Or
it's a tough one. It is. I don't know. It's a tough spot for me as a guy that loves history, that kind of has to naysay history to a small degree here. Like, if we look at Masonry, love it or hate it, most people appreciate Masonic history. Like, if Freemasonry started 5 years ago from scratch, it would not have the oomph that it does today, because we lean so heavily on, but George Washington, but Albert Pike, but all this foundation way before us. And that's what we lean on so heavy. If you look at like the bulk of and maybe it's dangerous to say that, but in my opinion, the bulk of the heavy ideas and research out there, we still look at those early guys. We're looking at Albert Mackey. We're looking at Pike. We're looking at those early guys. How many guys from 1930 or 1950 do we quote today in regards to how many guys we quote from the 1800s? So I don't know. There's a bit of a disconnect, because we have amazing minds in Masonry in every generation. We have some amazing minds today. But no matter how far we go, we still keep looking purely, in my opinion, in a large regard, back to kind of one group. And not that there's not anything to be learned there. There's tons to be learned there, and to be unpacked and re-unpacked, re-explored. But I don't know, it kind of takes away the fact of the right or the ability to dive deeper. looking at, well, they've already talked about all this. But the man I was the day I joined Masonry is not the man I am today. The way I thought and looked at life the day I joined Masonry, or hell, a year ago, is not exactly the same as what I am today.
I don't know. I wonder if it's almost easier because there's less information, and the information that's there is so focused. So, in Ohio, we have this Royal Schofield Society, and I was lucky enough to be one of the guys to help create it. When they proposed the name, I remember saying to myself, that sounds great. What the hell's a Schofield? I had no idea who this dude was. As I've kind of gone through this, our lives have intersected in so many ways. But never met the guy. He died before I ever became a Mason. But because he's still so recent, I can still go talk to people who sat in a room with him or sat in a lodge with him, who can tell me what his cologne smelled like, or what it was like to be in a car with him for 6 hours, or can tell me like those cute little stories that aren't in the Grand Lodge proceedings, or like those. But that information isn't as sanitized, isn't as firmly defined, isn't as, I don't know, vetted, for lack of a better word, or isn't as sanitized. I mean, but it doesn't mean it's
talked about the source material stuff, and that kind of falls into it because, for one, like weak example here, let's look at like annual proceedings, right? A Grand Master has a speech every year, and if you're there for it, that speech is a little different than when you read it in the printed version. That Grand Master may smirk a smile or may have some serious disappointment in one spot, and the way he projects and delivers that, you may not get from that written form. So when we go back and we look, I'm just that nerd that's always wondering what these guys, voice sound like, what their demeanor was. But hearing and seeing something delivered and being able to add that into the whole thing. I mean, just today, I send a text message to my wife and she thinks I'm pissed off at her. And it's like, no, I was giving you a compliment, right? So much is lost in that text. So even though we can consider that today as source material, that's the best of the best, it's not really. Like, if we could have a video, that would be so much better, or an audio recording, that'd be so much better. So there's layers to it, but yeah.
I think guys also seem to think that research is only history, or research is only guys who are 50 plus years ago. I don't know if they really, if they recognize that research can be modern. Research can be your own experience, or research can be making connections. It's okay if nobody else has. It's okay if nobody else has made those connections before or done that research. I mean, you are, and
yeah, Well, there's a lot to be said. Like, when I made the correlation with Doc after hundreds of meetings sitting there, and that third degree opening just hit him a little different. He perceived it differently this time. Those different lenses offer something. The people that, Albert Mackey, when he was going through and doing research and writing books, are amazing and on point, but they're through his perspective.
Of his time frame.
100%. There's many different perspectives to address that same topic. And, I think that's where the beauty we've talked today about guys that have no experience versus guys that have years and years of experience. There is still value to that varying perspective to add to the greater conversation. It's going to take that conversation in different directions, force you to, even if you don't agree with it, it's still going to probably spark a valuable conversation for either you, them, or both, of why you don't agree with it, and kind of digging deeper and working through those concepts. There's just a lot there to unpack.
Just because there's a coincidence doesn't mean that it's Masonically inspired, and I have seen so many papers written or presentations done, especially when it comes to things like sacred geometry. We see there's this ratio, and that means it's Masonic. Like, it doesn't mean it's Masonic. It means that there's something cool there, or that, I mean, it's coincidental, or it's
Yeah.
um there's only so many ways to look at being a human. So, you know, of course, the myth of Hiram Abiff is going to be a lot like the myth of Osiris, or the myth of.
But again, I think I mentioned this earlier, and this is coming from a guy that, I consider myself a history nerd, a historian, if you will. Freemasonry is not history. Freemasonry has history. If Freemasonry was launched 5 years ago with the same core tenets that it has today, it would still be that amazing thing that it is. It wouldn't have the roots that it has, but that's what so many of us purely focus on, is the roots and less on the objectives. Masonry has always been Masonry, right? We focus more on the experiences around it. Now, that's not to say that Masonic history doesn't have value. It does. And that's one of the things I love about it, is the connection. But also, as we've talked so much here about perspective, all these guys through history have experienced Masonry and learned from Masonry, gotten things right, gotten things wrong. And we can take from that, and that can impact our experience moving forward. We can learn from the good. We can learn from the bad. We can learn from the perspectives and see it different ways. But that doesn't make history, or that doesn't make Masonry history. It just has history.
So every Mason has to, in essence, interpret Freemasonry for themselves and express it in their own lives and in their own time. But that Masonic history is there to help inform our interpretation and aid our expression. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think in a big way, plus more. I mean, why has our modern society, and modern, you loosely there, been so obsessed with history? I mean, our nation, our Freemasonry, everything. The only reason we keep minutes, the only reason we do annual proceedings and all that, they're historical records. None of us like the minutes, so we're not keeping it just because we need to fill 20 minutes of the meeting. Now, that's not what Masonry is, even though some think it is. We record that history because there is value to be taken from it, both in Masonry, in our nation, in our lives. There is stuff that we take from our parents or our grandparents or the stories of our great grandparents that impact and alter the way that we live our lives today, because we use that as a guide to some degree. So that's where Masonic history greatly comes important, so that we don't repeat the same flaws, even though we do to some degree. But it can help us avoid from repeating. It can help us to gather some stuff we already know and look at it differently and improve that path forward. But then, at the same point, you were talking here about not everything's Masonic, right? And if you look at it, we get so caught up on, and then, caught up's probably the wrong word, but we focus so heavily on the symbology within Masonry. There's not much, if any, symbolism in Masonry that is quote unquote purely defined Masonic. It pretty much all came from somewhere else. And we're using that symbol to express a meaning that can't easily be expressed verbally or written. So while that stuff is not Masonic, there's good, it's a double-edged sword. I think I agree with you. We get very, very caught up on making Freemasonry what we want it to be today, and then everything becomes Masonry. Now, I think there's a lot of things where those outside sources can be an aid to the Masonry that we know and practice today. And we can look at those outside sources and say, when I can compare and contrast this and that to my Masonic experience, it impacts me this way in a good or bad fashion. For example, I think it was MasonicCon Chicago. I heard Dago Rodriguez speak, and he was comparing, what was it, Fight Club to Freemasonry, the movie.
Oh.
And, I'm like,
I can see.
what? And I'm so confused, right? But he gave this presentation and it was fantastic on many, many levels. For one, Dago has a background in movies, in movie production and writing and all that. So he's able to look at movies in an entirely different way than I had ever looked at it. So he comes forth breaking down the movie Fight Club. Because I'm like, how the hell do you connect this to Freemasonry? It's just like Michael Jarsbeck has done one connecting it to Star Wars, etc.
Yeah, I know. You and I talked about that.
Yeah. So I'm listening to him, break down Fight Club, and he breaks it down by the story type, and he explains the story type, and then you're able to connect that to so many other different movies. But then you're able to connect kind of the base story, that legend behind it, and compare and contrast it to the legend and the teachings of Freemasonry. And it's like, oh, well, that is an interesting way to compare that, or like look at it in that light. And certain aspects of that I wouldn't connect. Certain aspects of that, it's like, I can appreciate that, and that makes me think more about this, or this takes me a little farther down this think or this rabbit hole. So I think they can definitely be a benefit in some source, but at the same time, while many, take this stuff and this is Masonic, the movie Fight Club is not Masonic, right?
No.
But we're able to take stuff and compare and contrast that to our teachings and say, okay, this can help here, or we can take this away, or we can expand this conversation because of this, but that doesn't make the movie Masonic.
Masonry is not supposed to be limited by the walls of a lodge or the lodge meeting. So
100%.
So here's the other, you mentioned your podcast. If you're listening to the OLR research, you really should go check out Historical Light. I mean, it's a great podcast.
Shameless plug, go watch the episode.
Talking about that podcast, what are, I think, some of those moments that stick with you, or sort of those guests or those things that you've learned over the last 10 years of doing this? Like, if you were that internal, highlights reel, what sort of things are on there?
Man, so we have talked about literally everything. We've definitely talked about some of the more known, bigger Masonic history topics. And so again, I have a background in marketing. I run a digital marketing agency to this day. One of my highlights is an SEO. So I am guilty of having that objective eye for everything I do. So when I started this out, big thing I'm looking at is trying to rank online. When people search up for Masonic history, how am I going to show up? So I'm looking, all right, we need to check off this topic and this topic and this topic. I love the major topics. We've talked about Pike, we've talked about Wilmhurst, we've talked about Mackey, etc. And there's
Morgan
amazing
and all those guys. Yeah.
there. But what I've really, really enjoyed is having those guys on that no one's ever heard of before. They're not a national speaker. They're not, a big 33rd or this or that. They're a local lodge guy, and they're telling me about a lodge that I've never even heard about before, and some of those amazing stories and their version of that 94-year-old doc that belongs to their lodge, and how they got their starts. And that's kind of the niche that I've truly enjoyed, is those between the lines bits of history that I think deserve to get the time of day. And I kind of compare this in a loose manner, that when you go to any lodge, and pretty much in the United States, I don't know about elsewhere how much they focus on this, but pretty much any lodge in the United States, you're going to see a wall with photos of a past master or the past masters throughout all the years. And that's kind of the focal point, right? But the past masters through the years, while important, are like this much of the history. And while they're an important role, it also doesn't make them more important than that master mason that never held office. We have some amazing brothers and amazing stories that have carried out time, between those past masters or underneath those past masters, and etc. So that's kind of the representation of, we have all these, Masonic history books that are amazing, and other people documenting history that could be compared to the past master photos on the walls. I like to dig a little deeper and learn about those master masons, those sideline brothers, just the stories behind the lodge. Where'd your lodge come from? Why is it there? Who makes up your lodge? Why does your lodge matter, etc. Hearing those stories have really meant the world to me. Beyond that, and this is me having my own objection. I don't know what other people take from it. Hopefully they enjoy it, but just having conversations like we're having right now really makes it all worth it to me. I think Masonry gives us these tools, obviously, and I don't know. Again, maybe it's just me that gets caught up in this stuff, but I feel like a lot of times we just get caught in lodge. And when we leave lodge, we treat it kind of like work. We leave it there and we forget to take it into our lives. So like you and me sat on that episode and we talked about chickens for an hour. And while it was a joke and meant to be funny, I genuinely did learn from you. Like I have chickens, you have chickens, and that was one hell of an enjoyable conversation. And I kind of compare that to the Masonic journey, right? Like we take those teachings, those intentions into our life. And that's where Masonry should really be, in my opinion, is outside of lodge, in between meetings.
Yeah. The lodge room is the classroom, but the life is the lab.
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself. And so that is, I think, the highlight for me, that personal takeaway or that guilty pleasure, I guess, is that personal experience, getting to meet and have those conversations and compare and contrast ideas and just talk with brothers like you. That's been made every second of it worth it to me. Oh,
and I right back at you. I mean, I didn't really know you when we had that first conversation, and now, like, really, I really can't imagine a week going by where I haven't somehow talked to you or somehow gotten some kind of response like that. It is absolutely a thrill. Kansas Masonicon was the first time I ever met John Rourke in person, and he and I have been friends forever. And I just forgot his name, the dude from Canada.
Nicholas Lane.
Nick Lane walks in and he says, "You're Chad Kopenski." I'm like, "I hope so, because I have his keys." And he says, "Alex Herbert." And I said, "Yeah, Alex Herbert is, former master of the High Lodge of Research, one of the first members of Rose Schofield Society. He's a member of my lodge in Athens, but he'd moved away, and I met him off of Reddit is how I met Alex." And he's like, "Alex is a member of Castle Island Virtual Lodge in Canada, where I'm a member, and he says nice things about you. So you and I are going to be friends this weekend." I'm like, "Cool, I got a friend now. Awesome." That wouldn't have happened if those connections happen and they sneak up on you. And when they all of a sudden your world becomes bigger or brighter or different, and I'm going to give you credit for saying that the lodge is the classroom, but life is the lab, because it sounds like something you would say. But that's like that. That's it. Like once you go start practicing Masonry, it's amazingly what all happens. So I feel like we've come to a point where we probably could conclude and be.
Well, the chat always continues. We'll find another time.
Absolutely. So, and I'm so grateful that you are a part of my life, and thank you for doing this. So
right back at you, brother. You've definitely been one of those guys for me. I appreciate everything you do.
Right back at you. So, all right. Good night, my friend. See you later. Thanks for doing this.
So, thanks.
Bye.